Earlonne, Nigel, Amy.
Hello.
Hello.
This is a
What
first.
up?
This is a first.
This is a first, the four of
This
us
is
on
a
mic.
first.
Yeah.
First of us
Nigel,
on
we in
mic.
here with the heavy hitters.
I know.
That's right.
What are we doing
That's
here
how we're
first?
thought of on this team, I think.
Why are we all together today on mic?
I'm so glad you asked, Nigel.
Yes.
We thought before we released these last two episodes, which were about people getting off death row in San Quentin and then people getting off row at Central California Women's Facility, on the team we'd had a lot of conversations about how to frame the stories, how to approach particular parts of it. And then after the last episode came out, a lot of those issues were raised by listeners in comments and emails and Instagram. So we wanted just to get the four of us together, the people who were most involved in kind of both reporting, interviewing those stories, and then crafting the stories, to just talk through our experience making it, how we made some of the decisions we made. And I also have some of the comments that we receive printed out here. So I thought we could just maybe take a stab at talking about some of them.
Okay,
Sounds
cool.
good.
Cool.
And I should say, we have amazing listeners, very thoughtful. So we were very grateful for comments. Even the critical ones, I feel like were generally very civil and thoughtful, as we've come to expect from our dear listeners. And I guess maybe before we get in, I should name the issue, which is specifically like the people who we talked to in both episodes were convicted of, they all had condemned sentences because they were found guilty of doing some of the worst things somebody could do. And so, it raised questions about how we represented them, how we talked to them, the questions we talked to them about, and whether and how we talked about their crimes.
Yeah. Yep.
So maybe before we get into those questions, I thought it would be useful for us just to talk. Actually, I should say, I think people know Earlonne and Nigel.
If you don't, I'm Earlonne.
This is Nigel. Amy, people probably know as well, but is our editor and also a producer on a lot of the stories. So you're in a lot of the interviews, but also...
Though not these.
But not these. But you're also sort of lead the charge in thinking about the thorny issues. So, and I was the producer. I was at all of these interviews and also involved in sort of the editorial process, how we decided how to deal with all these things. So maybe we just start off, I thought it'd be useful for us just to talk about our experience reporting this story, working on these two stories, because we all had different experiences and started puzzling through a lot of these questions as we did these interviews.
Yeah. I could talk for a long time about this, so cut me off. Doing the men's one was felt very heavy. When I think about it, it's in the shade, meaning that it was darker and very emotional. Going back to death row with them definitely gave it a different feel. We didn't do that with the women. We only met them in a studio, in quotes, space. So after we did the men's one, I really wanted to do one at the women's to see how different it was. We went to CCWF, I think, 3 times. Mostly because we felt like we needed to keep getting more, that we weren't getting what we needed for the episode. So both of them weighed heavily on me. I was surprised by the different tone of the 2 interviews, probably as surprised as most listeners were. And I wanted to do justice to what it means to be on death row, what's the responsibility of talking to people who have committed really serious crimes, but also allowing them to just be who they were in the moment. So those are things I was thinking about.
And so, Earlonne, you also came into San Quentin for almost all of that reporting, going back to death row, talking to them before. I don't think you were there for the follow-up we did with Steve and Vo. And then you were there on all the 3.
CCWF, I think, me personally, as a person that has spent close to like 30 years in prison, I think I see it from I guess you could say a different lens when I talk to people that's incarcerated. I try not to talk to them from a point of view of judging. So when I walked into it, I was, just open just to hear what they had to say, what they takeaways was, what their point of views was. That's pretty much what my thoughts was, because being in San Quentin and watching the men in there not be chained anymore, I was really curious about how was that look, being around people now that you're no longer restrained, you know what I'm saying? And crazy part is you the same person. You know how you haven't changed. So what's the difference? So that was just my thought process.
two things I might mention. One thing that just affected the overall tone, I think, was that we were able to go back to condemned row at San Quentin with the guys. We couldn't do that at Central California Women's Facility. And I think you could describe it as being a very shadowed experience. I think so much of that was because we could go back to that place with them. So both they were encountering it again, but also we experienced what is, I mean, physically, it's just like a very dark place and a place you imagine with a lot of heavy history.
Yeah.
And we didn't have that experience with the women at all.
No.
Yeah, it was like going to purgatory.
Mm-hmm.
Well, even just going to the housing units at San Quentin and the housing units at CCW, I've been to other ones, they are night and day. All of the housing units at San Quentin are pretty dark, dank places. And the ones at CCWF just aren't. So I can imagine, they're much more open. They've got windows. I can imagine from the way they described death row, it probably looked very similar.
Yeah.
So I think physically we would have had a different experience, even if emotionally they had, some dark times there. I don't want to get ahead of what we're talking about, but from the way they discussed it, I imagine that they would have a different physical reaction to being back there.
And I thought maybe we could talk about how the four of us sort of thought about and processed the crimes that these people did. Might be worth getting to before we get to the listener questions.
Yeah.
Before we do that, though, I thought it would be useful for somebody to remind us listeners why our general practice is to not talk about people's crimes. And like 99% of the stories we do, we don't get into people's crimes.
We don't. Right. I mean, Earlonne mentioned this, but I do the same thing. I'm not there to judge people. I'm there to listen to them. And in most cases, their crime is not essential to the story. It still wasn't on the death row episode. For many years, I've had not a rule for myself. I just wasn't curious. I never looked at people's crimes. That's a recent change for me. And I don't always. And I actually prefer to not do it because it isn't salient to the story at hand. That's changed slightly, and we can talk about that. But the story was not about what you did to get to death row. It was about what is it like to leave death row. So it didn't seem important to the story.
And I think like the origins of Ear Hustle is to talk about what a day in the life of you in prison. What is our slogan?
Yeah. Everyday stories of life inside.
Everyday stories told by those who are living it.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily what got you to prison. Is how are you able to live a life inside this place?
And unfortunately, that may lead people to think we don't care about victims, which isn't the case at all.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think early on when we was doing stories that were really, let's just say, the crime might have been foul, whatever you want to say, and a person might not want to listen to the story if you say, well, this person, and I'm just speaking, put a baby in the microwave. Right, and I'm just speaking extreme. But if a person hear the story and then find that out later, then they may have something to say, or they might just pass it by, or they might learn something from it. But if we started off with this person did this, that, you might turn off some good information or something that's very relevant to probably your life. Yeah,
it's hard to hear a story about somebody's daily life if you've heard what that they've been convicted of a pretty horrible
totally thing. In some cases just totally distracting, and that would be the thing that the listener took away from that episode would be some story of a crime that really had nothing to do with whatever story we're trying to tell. I think there's sort of like philosophical reasons, like we're talking to people where they are now about who they are now. Often this is a crime that they committed 20 years ago. Not that the length of time necessarily matters, but practically speaking, also like how much of the crime can we tell? It becomes sort of impossible. I mean, do we tell the full story? Do we tell the victim's perspective and also the guy who did it's perspective? Do we look into the causes? Do we how much of the backstory? That's like it's both a level of reporting that we're just not set up to do, but also it's not the story that we came to tell.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a policy that we can kind of stick to across the board.
And based on who we talk to, that would be the easiest thing to do. is to talk about people crimes.
Oh my God.
Yes.
I mean, we have
Yeah.
Probably more popular podcast.
it's very popular because
Make me
people
thrill.
are into crime podcasts, but we try not to go that route.
Yeah.
I know we've actually intentionally, I think, many times walked away from a lot of listeners when we've
I'm
chosen
sure.
not to align
Right.
ourselves
Yeah.
with the sort of more true crime genre of podcast.
And
And
there's
we do
times when
do
I
that.
wish we could.
Right.
Honestly, we've had episodes, I won't say which ones, where if you knew, more of that story, it would, in interesting ways, change the way you heard the story that we're telling. But we've made the decision even then to walk back from it. That said, we've also done a whole bunch of episodes where we talk a lot about people's crimes.
And we're very
so-
specific about it, and there's there's always a reason why. It's very clear at the beginning of the episode why we're going to be talking about a crime.
We did one this season that was maybe our most concentrated attempt at true crime, or sort of play with the genre, which was about sort of a guy who's in
Spark
prison
plug.
for doing a bunch of bank robberies.
Yeah.
And it was, I look at that as like, on the spectrum of crime, that was more of a lighthearted type of situation. I mean, I can say that as a former criminal, I can tell you that is a lighthearted fantasy world where they do movies about that type of shit. You know what I'm saying? It's a Ocean's 8, Ocean's 12, Ocean's, shit like that. So that's a fun type of situation.
Yeah, a lot of the crimes
Sorry.
are not fun.
I know what you're saying.
And Nigel, you mentioned that you have traditionally not wanted to know people's crimes,
Yeah.
and we've talked that a little bit before. I think our sort of practice now is that the producers on the story will typically look up what people have done, in part because it's just we want to know kind of what is publicly available, and so because it's part of how the episode will land with listeners.
Also, sometimes there are ways that the person's crime, this came up in a much earlier episode before I even started, but there are ways that a person's crime actually does have something to do with the story they're talking about, and we want to know that. So I think my feeling is that, as producer or as editor, I want to know, at least for someone we're spending a significant amount of time with, I want to know what they're in for. But I don't bring it up with Nigel or Earlonne unless you guys specifically ask me.
But before you started working on the show, we never looked at people's crimes.
But I'm thinking of what was the episode where
No,
it was
actually,
about,
a listener has a question about that, so we might.
great.
We're going to
Okay.
get to that when we get to the listener questions.
But we never, no one ever looked up their crime regardless, unless it was, and I'm not sure before you came on if we did a story about a crime. Maybe the trail. I can't remember the order.
Yeah.
But I don't think anyone felt that. Like that is a different desire now.
And when you do find something out, it may change the story a little bit. It may trigger something. Because I can give you a good example. The Big No-No.
that's
Yeah.
the
That's the
one
one
you
we're
were
talking about. That actually, that's a listener
someone
asked
brings
about
up.
that.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a very that's a very specific situation, which made the story better.
Yeah, definitely.
Should we just talk about that quickly
Yeah.
since it's it's come up now? So the big no-no is
Yeah, a story we did about falling in love, what happens when you fall in love with a volunteer and what the process is. And we had just about finished this story, and it was Earlonne who said to me, do you know why he's in prison? And finding out why he was in prison, he had killed his wife. Was it wife or girlfriend? His partner, whatever.
Killed his kid, mom.
Yeah. And then we went back and we talked to him about that crime. And it felt like it was hard to do that story without bringing it up.
and it would have been hard to do this story without bringing it up because the story up until that point had been about a romantic relationship of his, and meanwhile he has this in his past.
I was also really trained to never talk about people's crimes because I started volunteering as a teacher there, and that was just part of the ethics of doing that. And I just took that to doing Ear Hustle without thinking about it.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't realize
Are
that.
you nostalgic? I mean, how do you feel about the sort of the turn we've taken towards having more information rather than less?
Sometimes I wish we didn't, to be honest.
Yeah.
Unless there's a story that it matters. But you can't say that we wouldn't know it matters if we didn't do it.
I
So it's
know.
kind of like
But I'm thinking like you're a naturally curious person, and sometimes I will know something and you'll ask me and I'll be like, well, I don't know if I, but I tell you because you've asked, but I wonder if you kind of rather I said.
I was never, this is completely honest, I was never curious about the crimes until other people on the team started being curious about the crimes. And I don't know if we want to save that for another question, but
I was going to get there probably
Okay.
next.
yeah.
Yeah.
I do think that a lot of it, from my perspective, is just people's curiosity. They want to know, and I'm not sure it's always so important. And I do note, and I don't really like admitting this, when we talk about it, we become kind of gossipy, and I can see our body language changes, our voices change. There's a giddiness to the conversation. So there's something very gossipy about wanting to know.
It's rubbernecky. It's not a pretty.
It's not a good part of your soul coming out. It's not a good part of
our soul. Yes, but we are humans, like our listeners.
Yeah, exactly.
And we are curious too.
So I get when listeners are curious.
Yeah,
but I think we've also done a lot of work on how we feel about it, and how we think about it. And sometimes I think people who listen may be reacting out of anger or some other feeling without having really done the work to think about what does it mean to want to know about people's crimes.
Yeah. So this might actually be a useful case in point to help examine how we feel about these things, because and we can not go into this now if it doesn't make sense, but at least my experience working on these 2 episodes was so we spent 3 days over the course of a few weeks with the women at CCWF. The first time we talked to Bubbles and Manling, they were really fun to talk to. They were very funny, sweet, kind, thoughtful. I certainly left the prison wanting to know what they did, which I don't normally. And I think it kind of speaks to some of this rubbernecky voyeurism. And I mean, I think since then we've been kind of puzzling through, or at least I have been puzzling through why in those cases, why in this particular case I had this. And it wasn't, I'd love to say it was like high journalistic principles, but I think it was more sort of like true crimey voyeurism. And also definitely like the dissonance between like the people that they were in our conversation with them and what I would imagine somebody would have to be convicted of to be given a death sentence.
Yes.
And of course, anytime you see a woman that's on condemned row, it's going to pop in your head like, what the fuck you do?
And
this is where I have this is my bone to pick. This is my bone to pick.
Yeah.
You want to say more about that before I start picking at it?
Before you pick that bone, there's 700 and something men on death row and only 20 something women on death row. So you, in your mind, you like, okay, well maybe one of their crime partners is on a man on death row. You know what I'm saying? But what did you do to where you received such a sentence? You know, and that's. You know, and of course, I don't care who you run into. You can run into the most prolific serial killer and have a regular conversation. You know what I'm saying? Because you are meeting a person he just the regular cat. He's not in his element. He's not late at night snatching up people, you know, doing that type of shit. You meeting a person just, you know, over a bowl of breakfast, a bowl of cereal. You know what I'm saying? And you just having a conversation. So you're not really, you know, into whatever it was they did, you know. But I don't know. It's just when it comes down to the women, it just intrigues me of why are you on death row?
I think there's so many fewer of them. I'm not sure that's like a misogyn, like a sexist.
You know, I 100% believe it's sexism, 100%. But I want to say one thing before that. The other thing is, and I don't know if it's the same with the women, what always keeps me thinking is that I've met people on the main line who have done the same crimes as people who are on death row. And so they're not always extreme. Of course, taking anyone's life is terrible, but it's not like everyone on death row is a serial killer or, you know, a sadist. It depends on where you were prosecuted.
I know a gang of people on the main line who have worse crimes than people on death row. But it's about what county they were in, what that prosecutor wanted to charge. Was that prosecutor looking for some type of political ambition where they was like, I'm going to have a death row rate. I'm going to convict 99% of the people. So, you know, most of the people that's on death row are from Southern California. Or from LA, or from Riverside, you know. So, it may be only a couple of people from Northern California that's on death row because that's not the climate up here.
Yeah, because it's more judges are more progressive up here, less
it's
likely
not even the
to
judges; it's the prosecutors.
Oh, okay.
The
less
judges is
likely to
just
ask
there
for the
as referees, but the prosecutors are going to ask for that.
I see.
And they're more liberal. I want to say more liberal in Northern California. They're not with that. Yep. But in Southern Cal, they don't give a fuck.
But I want to go back. Can I just go back to the sexism part? I I do really believe there's some inherent sexism in it. I mean, as Earlonne said, a woman's there and you're curious. I am too, and I can admit it's my own sexism. But where I note it is often in comments from listeners that they tend to be much harder on women that we do stories on than they are on men. Now, I didn't read a single comment asking or commenting on what the men did to get to death row in the story we did. There were quite a few comments. I looked those women up. I saw what they did. Blah, blah. How could you do a story about them? There was not a single comment like that about the men. And when we've done stories about women with other cases, they've been really harsh. Like when we did a story about people who abused children. The one person who people really got on was the woman that had been married to somebody.
And she didn't even do that.
She was
in an episode
married
of
to the
actual
person.
Yes.
child. Yeah,
she was the
right.
one non-perpetrator in the episode.
So I would like all people, and myself included, is to really think about that when you have these reactions. Is there any inherent assumptions you're making, or are you harder on women than men? I don't think it's 100%.
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, Amy. But
There's a couple other factors. The women are really easy to Google. I think maybe that's also another reason that we got
really
these
easy.
comments.
Yeah.
There's 20 of them, and we have their first names. They're out there. But coming back to what you were saying a second ago, Earlonne, we got a bunch of these kinds of emails in response to the death row episodes. But I'm surprised that we don't hear more often from listeners about people in other episodes, because to your point,
Yeah.
these are not the only people on Ear Hustle who have done things that would
Yes.
be really shocking if
Right.
listeners
But Death
knew
Row-
about it. And
But yeah, I think death row just raises all sorts of images and
Yeah.
questions.
The
and
condemned sentence.
yeah.
Yeah, that must be a lot of it, right? That condemned is the worst sentence you can get.
yeah.
There have been movies about it. There's serial killers on
Right.
death
Yes.
row.
But one of the listeners said, why aren't, these are people on death row, why aren't you saying what their crimes were? And I say,
yeah,
well, where's the line there?
Yeah.
You want crimes for death row, but not for a life sentence. I mean,
Yeah.
those are some pretty gnarly crimes too, often.
Yeah, then
And it
where
could be
do-
the
where
same
do we-
crime.
And if we're
Yeah,
saying
or the
they're
same
on
crime,
condemned
exactly.
row, I don't want to say you can imagine what their crime was, but you can definitely think that,
You can
okay,
come
it
up with
had to
some
do with
ideas,
murder.
yeah.
You know it's a capital offense.
Yeah.
But I understand, because we had the same issue, the lightness of the episode and their laughing was a conundrum to us. I don't know if we want to...
You want to say
Yeah.
more about that?
Yeah,
What
I mean,
did
we went back 2 more times because, or at least 1 more time. I don't know if it was 2 more. I know we were there 3 times because we were, after we left, like, it's really strange. Like, they are laughing so much, they're reminiscing. They made it sound like it was a wonderful time. And we tried in the episode to push them on that. We didn't get much of... They didn't really want to go there, but it's not like we didn't try. It's not like we didn't note it. We all noted it. We literally say it in the episode. We found their reaction.
This is the
confusing.
women of death row.
Yes, the
when
women
you
of
talk
death
to
row.
them about sort of what was your time like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My takeaway from that is this, and I'm a person that served a lot of time in prison. I look at it like, and I want to make a comparison, but this might be the bullshittest comparison ever. But let's say, for instance, your mother passed away. You're going to be sad for a little while, right? And as time go on, your laughter is going to come back. You know what I'm saying? So when some of these people commit crimes, heinous crimes, whatever they was going through in their life, snapped, whatever it was, they're going to be down for a while. But as the time go on and the years go on and the decades go on, they're going to find themselves. They're going to be back to smiling, back to laughing, back to just normal everyday life like everybody else. When people go through stuff with how bad it is, they're going to be down for a minute, but then you'll bounce back. It's not going to be, you're going to be that person forever. You know what I'm saying? You're going to be stuck in that
men's
moment.
crimes were just as
I'm talking about
distant.
men and women.
Yeah,
You're
but
going
in
to
the
be the
men's
same.
episode, there was no jovial
So
laughing.
I look at the men's situation. So I'm always going to look at both of these situations as different because they both did different time. The men technically did the time. It's just like when we was interviewing the people in the shoe. They were kind of stoic. They were kind of like, spaced out because they were isolated. It's a difference. The women were isolated, but they weren't isolated. They were in a community environment. So I can look at it just from that angle of the difference between the two. Yes, they both were sentenced to be condemned, but the men were isolated. One person in a cell. The women was one person in a cell, but their doors were open all day.
Yeah.
They hung out with each other. They was, So I think it's just a little different there. And then again, the violence on death row. Like death row
on men's death
on the
row.
men's death row was violent. Like people were going to the yard and dying.
Yeah.
People were going to the yard getting stabbed. You know, all kind of stuff. So I think it was a different environment, a chaotic environment.
Totally.
But that does raise a question that I've been wondering about, and I think some of the listeners' questions raise, is that are there certain crimes where laughter is never appropriate? I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but like...
Yeah.
I think, can I take an adventure at it? I think the question maybe at the heart of it is like, if somebody did something really terrible, and we could have lots of debates over what qualifies, but should that crime hang over them every single day of their lives? Like to the
Every
point
minute
where...
of their day.
Every minute of their day, to the point where... And I'm not trying to mock this position, but some people might say, no, they should not ever laugh again, you know? They should not have access to, you know, a TV, let alone like good times with their friends. And because when we talked to those women, that's what we heard. They were laughing and having good times with their friends. And listeners, I think totally understandably had reactions to that. Like, that's not okay. But that's what I feel like is like, that's the reaction we want you to have listening to this. You know, it's complicated. I don't know what the answer to that is.
Yes. Well, I wish people would realize we think about all these things when we're making the episode.
We really do.
I mean, it's like to ask, like, how could you do that? We think about that stuff. None of this is done flippantly or without heavy consideration. And we weren't asking them about their crimes. We were asking them about life on the row and life after the row. I think with a lot of them, if we sat down and we said, we want to talk about your crime and your feelings about it, the conversation would have been different.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure of that. So.
One other thing that makes me think is that the fact that there was a lightness to them, whether it was appropriate or not, it felt real in a way that if they were only talking about how horrible it was, what they did, how they think every day they're, you know, just sort of like burdened by the severity of what they did, that might have felt a lot more performative or a lot less authentic. I mean, I think you could hear the things that some people might have wanted to hear, and it's not actually a genuine sentiment. And we, more than anything, we probably want these people to be honest in who they are and how they feel. And I think some of that was what we were hearing.
And I'm gonna pull it out of condemn row. When I was still incarcerated, Nigel used to get the letters to say, "Why are they laughing?"
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, why are they? You know, and it's like, we human. You know what I'm saying? We're gonna laugh. We're gonna cry sometime. We're gonna, you know, be who we are. You know. So if people feel that just because you're in prison, you can't laugh. You can't joke. You're not looking at the reality of life. I mean, I'm gonna just say, as an American, you know, we might not participate in it directly, but we commit atrocities beyond these borders, and we laugh every day. We drop bombs on people, and we laugh every day. We're not doing it personally, but we're voting in people that's doing it, or this is our government that's doing it, and it's on our hands, you know? So, I don't know. I think, and then when I'm gonna go back, I know I'm switching, but with the women that's on the row, I looked at it from this point too. You know, again, I can't judge nobody. Who am I to judge you? You know, most of the women that we talk to committed crimes against their own family. That's something they got to deal with for the rest of their life. And they're going to find happiness in a day. But then they also going to cry when we're not looking. They also going to feel that shit.
So you're not too concerned that they're like not suffering enough.
They suffer. Anybody that commits a crime is, and I'm not even going to say in that aspect of it, we can go to Karen that did something that her daughter ended up passing away based on a crash, but it was her decision. That's going to kill her. The time ain't going to kill you. It's how you going to feel inside that's going to kill you over time. You know, like every night before you go to sleep, what you going to think about?
Yeah.
You know, so.
But even if there were someone who committed it just for the sake of argument, did something truly terrible and never suffered from, you know, like they were just happy all the time, that would still be just the way it is. That would be the reality of this person's life, whether you like it or not. And I think that's the goal of the show, is to show how things are, not how we think they should be.
Yes. I believe there was a comment about, why are you glorifying these people? I don't think any of our stories are meant to glorify anyone. They're giving people, we're telling stories, and, our job is not to glorify anybody. I don't think just giving someone the space to talk is glorifying them.
Yeah.
I think that's a misuse of the word glorify and what we are trying to do. I don't want to get into here, but listeners may be very surprised at how some of us actually feel about sentencing. I mean, we have all different feelings on this team about what is appropriate for people to be in prison for and for how long. It doesn't mean we can't tell these kinds of stories and have the feelings that we have about it. Not everyone on this team is all prisons should go away person. So listeners should know that.
Yeah.
Amy, you actually have to go.
I have to go.
Should we continue, or or was that good?
It's up to you.
Why don't you? I think you guys can wrap up without me, but
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
It's good talking to you.
Okay, Amy. Sorry, you have to go.
That's
Thank
okay.
you. Do you want me just to read some of the comments?
Yeah.
So Amy unfortunately had to go, which is unfortunate because she really helps us wrestle through all of these questions. But hopefully we'll be doing more of this in the future. But yeah, I did want to, we've been talking kind of in general about some of the feedback we got. I have some of it in front of me. And I will say, to Nigel's point, with the episode we did on men getting off of death row, we did have one listener say that I think this is the first episode where I felt that the crime needed to be explained. And I would imagine, and then they go on to say, but that being said, it's not what Ear Hustle is about, so I get it. I love how it becomes a human story. I do wonder if they're responding to Steve in the men's death row episode, who, like, the second part of the episode was all about him. We wanted to understand more of the heaviness that he was feeling when he was back on the row, and it's turned out that it was a lot about his victim.
Yeah.
So I wonder if they were particularly responding to that, or if that's what made them wonder what the crime was about, which actually I think Amy said that you all did wrestle with, sort of, should we say more about Steve's crime? But I think eventually we came back to that gets in the way of Steve today. Then once people hear his crime, that's all they're going to be able to think about, and they're not going to be able to sort of like hear him.
I think, of course, what we do probably isn't for everybody. Some people are going to be sensitive towards that. Survivors of crime or crime victims may be sensitive towards certain things. We've heard from everyone. We've heard from survivors of crime and all that love what we do because it opens up a door, it opens up a conversation. And you got to be able to have a conversation, you got to be able to, especially if you're in the storytelling, we're not here to, make people famous for their crimes. The media does that and the movies does that, But I think, what we do is we have at least a dialogue about a story or a moment in somebody's life. It's not about what you did to get here. It's how you're able to survive in this type of place. So I think I look at it from that point of view.
Yeah.
And me, a person that did a lot of time, I used to judge people. Like, say, for instance, if someone was going to SNY, sensitive needs yard, I was judging the shit out you. How you gonna live this life and then you gonna punk out and go over there. But then when I got out of prison, and the first prison I went back into was a sensitive needs prison. And I sat down and I talked to some of these cats. And what dawned on me that I didn't see then was that, these cats want to go home to their family and loved ones. They don't want to live by the rules that somebody else is enforcing on them. They want to be able to dictate and govern their own life and be able to get out. So me over here judging them thinking they punked the game, in all actuality, they just manned up and was like, I'm done with that shit.
And these are people who would have been on a sensitive needs yard because they left a gang.
They left the gang. Yeah. Some of them may have debriefed, but most of them left the gang for whatever reason. And I think one of the reasons was I want to get home to my family. I don't want to be in here for the rest of my life, And, when you caught up in that gang life, you're not in control of your life. Somebody else can say, hey, man, you got to go over there and kill your homeboy. And that's what you got to go do, or, whatever. But, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is, like, with a better understanding of people or situations, you tend to know just a little bit more. And I think that's what we try our best to do is, like, tell these stories where people can connect dots and, hear different points of views, different sides of it. So, yeah.
Let me start reading through some of these emails just in case they spur anything we kind of want to talk about more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One person says, it was the first time that the lightness and humor felt disrespectful towards the victims. They say, "Your also does such an incredible job of holding the tensions of the past crimes alongside the human beings in process. It felt like the victims had no place in this episode, and I couldn't stop thinking about the pain it might cause their friends and families to listen to this episode."
Yeah, I mean, that's true for any story we tell. If there's friends or victims, no matter what the topic is. But I understand. I mean, we thought a lot about the lightheartedness of it. But again, that's where we were, and I think we did try to push them. I mean, I literally said to them something along the lines of, people are going to hear this and think all this laughing means you're not being accountable. And they had a response to that. We can't tell them what to say. So
Right. And I think they, so for one, they got condemned. They're condemned. They're up until the law changed, they were sequestered, right? And they created their own environment, their own world, with let's say the women, the 23 of them, and that was their world, and that's how they were able to survive and do whatever they do, you know what I'm saying? And not, like the one lady said, she was suicidal for a long time, she was able to maintain, and she's still here today based on that. So I think, everybody gonna look at things differently. And I think with them, they were able to adapt.
absolutely.
Another listener wrote, they're not sure that they feel sympathetic for someone who was on their way to killing their third infant, but tears up at being so glad at having found a community. Honestly, the podcast's refusal to wrestle with this issue makes me wonder if I should listen. These death row episodes have been far too cheerful without giving us any exploration of what put these people into that place, except a tiny acknowledgement by way of using it to add to the perpetrator's own, quote, anguish at being in the place where juries said they belonged.
Did they listen to the men's episode? That was not a cheery episode.
Yeah. I didn't know what to make of them talking about 2 death row episodes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, and again, I look at that like, okay, we're not here. We're not in the business of judging people. It's fucked up. A person killed 2 of their infants and was on the mission to kill the third one or whatever it was. And, I don't know who that person was at that time. You know what I'm saying? The person I met, was totally different from that. But I don't know. Who knows? Nobody knows.
Yeah.
So it's hard for us to like, okay, we heard what you did, so we can't do a story with you. So we're going to discriminate against you and not do the story based on this information. I don't think it's like that. I don't think we that ain't the business we in.
Also, we're not asking anyone to be sympathetic. It's fine if you're not sympathetic. Right. In fact, it's preferable that people have their own feelings and reactions. But what I want to go back to is, believe me, we think about all of these things. We are not blithely going into an episode like this. It's part of what's happening behind the scenes. And we confronted it maybe in a gentle way in this episode by pushing back on them about why they're laughing. But that was the story.
And just another one on that point. We're doing stories in prison.
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know what else to say about that. We're doing stories in prison, so some shit may come up that is hard to swallow, Yeah. But we do our best to do these stories righteously.
Yeah. And I really appreciate listeners reaching out with their questions.
Yeah.
I think it means that they care. So we take these seriously. We think about them. We apply them to the next episode. Though I don't think our directive will change.
I do want to underline what I think both of you said, but just if people have complicated feelings at the end of our episode, great. That's kind of the point.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And also one thing that might be worth thinking about is that what happened with a lot of these people is that they listened to the episode, they Googled the people, and then they had some questions about the episode.
Yeah.
These folks, because of their sentences, have had true crime stories written about them. That's the thing you find when you Google.
Yeah.
So that's another factor here, is that you can quickly look these people up and have a particular interpretation of their lives quickly at your fingertips.
Yeah.
And it is also, I mean, I'm not trying to excuse what they actually did or what they were convicted of doing, but there's sort of like, I think the true crime industrial complex is playing into this as well,
Yes.
you know?
For sure.
And you know, I give you a good example about that too, and this is totally different, but, you know, when I got arrested or something happened, you know, we was like, damn, it didn't even happen like that. But that's how the media is playing it out. That's how, so when the news reporter, you hear about a crime in society that happened yesterday, you're not hearing it from the defense side or, you know, what happened. You're hearing it from what the police suspect or what they found so far. So whatever they putting together is just one-sided. It's just the police side of what transpired.
A few more comments or bits of comments I wanted to read out. Yeah, one person's just wrestling it and with sort of hearing the episode and has found themselves thinking a lot and says, I want to be kind, understanding, and compassionate for a fellow human, but I'm not sure I can. Which, yeah, does sort of raise this question of, are there certain crimes that you can't see past, or are there certain crimes that people can kind of commit and never move past? And yeah, I don't know.
I've got my one name I'm not going to bring up, but I think that's a personal question for each one to answer.
Yep.
Yeah. And it also depends, I think, if you've ever been a victim of a violent crime. If you haven't, it's probably pretty hard to answer that question with any kind of certainty.
One quick one says, most of them are baby killers. Do better, ear hustle. Do not glorify these stone cold killers.
It's a trip. That person isn't the only one that has that opinion. You know, some women in the prison system have that same opinion
That's
towards
true.
people that are on condemned row.
That even came up in the episode.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the quibble I would have with that person is not quite sure how he glorified them.
Glorify is
That's the part
word,
that I scratched my head a little bit about, because I don't think there was anything that glorified them.
Yeah, maybe the question is like, do listeners think there's certain people that should just not be heard from?
Yeah.
You know, and obviously, I mean, in a podcast that is about people in prison, we're not going to make that call. That's not what we're about.
Yeah, exactly.
One question, and actually one listener did mention this. They said, do you ever think about doing stories with prosecutors or victims? And we have done both, but it's definitely not the majority of what we do. But I would point to The Trail,
Yes,
and also Shine Some Light as episodes where Shine Some Light was exclusively the story of a victim, and The Trail told the story of a victim as part of somebody's story about committing crimes against that person, a crime against that person. But yeah, it isn't the majority of what we do, and I feel like, and we do wrestle sometimes with, I don't think it's what our responsibility to victims is. That's maybe not quite the right way to phrase it, but sort of how should we think about that in the scope of what we do?
Yeah. I would talk to more victims for sure. It would depend. Just like I would love to talk to more correctional officers, people who work in corrections. I would love to hear more sides of it. And the two that you bring up, Bruce, were incredibly powerful episodes. Don't think we don't care about victims. That would be a really wrong assumption, because we do. It's just not necessarily the kinds of stories we tell, but I think that they're important voices. And I've reached out when I've had qualms about stories to victims groups to ask their opinion about things that we've done. So it is something that's on my mind quite a bit.
I was just trying to think of what was the victims' right group we was dealing with, and who did we talk to?
Well, I guess I should mention two other episodes that sort of spring out of restorative justice practices. One is Tell Christy I Love Her.
Yep.
Which should
That's
have been,
right.
Which was talk to the
perpetrator and the victim.
And the wife of the victim, who I guess was also a victim.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then also Dirty Water, which was it was about, somebody who was a sex trafficker and somebody who was sex trafficked.
Yes.
And it wasn't, the sex trafficked person wasn't the victim of the sex trafficker, but it was definitely set up as a way to sort of discuss being on two sides of that crime.
Definitely.
And that person was a victim and in prison.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
She
Right.
had
And
both
was
sides.
commuted later based on,
Yeah.
and pardoned later based on, they realized that this person was trafficked, this person was groomed, this person was all that.
Yeah.
And, it was a travesty that, even in that case, the prosecution would not let her bring in her defense. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know who was the more victim there, you know?
I mean, I don't know if I want this in the episode or not, but when we started doing this, I had a fairly long conversation with Mark Klass. I reached out to him, just Polly Klass's father. And he was very kind. And we had an email, a few emails back and forth, because I really wanted to know his opinion on what he would think of a podcast like this. And it was a really good conversation. So it is something that's been on my mind since the beginning of making this podcast.
Yeah. It would be interesting. I mean, I know I've just randomly spoken to a few people who work supporting victims who say they don't listen to Ear Hustle. And I imagine a lot of people who have been victims of crimes don't.
Yeah.
But how do you ever educate yourself if you don't listen to the other side? And it could be hard for some people, but I think in order to find healing, you got to be able to hear it all. You know what I'm saying? You got to hear both sides. You got to hear, because you never know what may snap in your head to where, oh, okay. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not saying everybody gonna get that, but I know we've heard from a lot of victims that like what we do. It opens doors that otherwise wouldn't be open to them. And I'm not saying that they need to hear an assailant side of it, but sometimes they do.
Well, and that was Christy's experience in that episode, was getting to know Jason, sort of confronting him, or not in a confrontational way, but sort of like become face to face with him, was pretty essential into her kind of moving past it and healing, I would say. Yeah.
I mean, I've said this, I'll just repeat it. Until I'm in that situation, I have no idea how I would feel. And so I wouldn't judge any victim for how they feel about what we do or what they do or do not want to hear. How can you answer that until you experience what they've experienced?
Right. But then again, if we was to, let's say, for instance, if that was, we talking to victims and we're doing this, then we become a crime show for real.
Yeah. I mean, I do think there's no shortage of stories about crimes.
No, definitely. It's one of the most popular genres.
Yeah.
And there are a lot fewer stories about day-to-day life in prison.
Yep.
All right. We should wrap it up.
Okay. Thanks. That was great.
Yeah.
Thanks,
No,
listeners. We
definitely.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, listeners. Seriously, we can't say it very genuinely. Thank you for listening so closely and expressing yourselves clearly and with not that much vitriol.
Yep. and check us if we're in the wrong. We open for that. That brings a larger conversation and make us look at things differently.
All right. Thank you all.